Why calm people always win under pressure. Watch what happens to people when the pressure becomes real. Not the anticipated pressure, not the difficulty they saw coming and prepared for. The unexpected kind, the situation that arrives without notice and demands a response before there has been time to compose one. The conversation that shifts without warning into something far more consequential than it appeared. The moment when the stakes clarify suddenly and the gap between who you appear to be and who you actually are narrows to almost nothing. In those moments, something separates. The people who are calm in easy circumstances but reactive when conditions harden become visible for what they are. The people who perform composure through carefully managed situations but lose it when the situation stops cooperating reveal the performance for what it was. And the people who are genuinely calm, whose regulated state is a built capacity rather than a cultivated appearance, continue to function, continue to think, continue to make decisions of genuine quality while everything around them is pressurizing everyone else. This difference is not temperamental. It is not the gift of a specifically calm personality type. Not the advantage of having encountered less difficulty, not the product of having more certainty about outcomes. It is a built capacity, the specific, trainable ability to maintain the internal regulatory state that thinking and judgment require precisely in the conditions that most undermine it. Calm people win under pressure not because pressure affects them less. It is because the calm they have built allows them to keep their cognitive access intact when everyone else's has degraded. They are thinking when others have stopped thinking and started reacting. They are assessing when others have stopped assessing and started performing. They are choosing when others have stopped choosing and started executing whatever the activated state has generated. That difference between thinking and reacting, between assessing and performing, between choosing and executing automatically is the difference this audiobook builds toward. Not a different personality, a different internal architecture. One that produces genuine composure as a reliable function rather than a circumstantially dependent appearance. 10 chapters, each one a layer of the psychology of calm under pressure, why pressure degrades most people's thinking, how composure is built and maintained as a genuine capacity, what it produces in communication and perception and leadership and decision-making, and how it transforms the experience of difficult circumstances from something that tests your limits to something that reveals the strength of what you have built. Chapter 1 begins with the most revealing moment available in human behavior. Pressure. Introduction. What calm actually is. The word calm is frequently misunderstood, and the misunderstanding costs people the very thing they are trying to build. In common usage, calm describes a surface quality of visible stillness, a lack of visible agitation, the appearance of ease in difficult circumstances. Under this understanding, calm is something that can be performed, the deliberate presentation of a composed exterior over whatever internal state is actually running. This version of calm is familiar, it is sometimes useful, and it is not what this audiobook is building. Genuine calm is an internal quality, not a surface one. It is the actual regulated state, the functional condition of the nervous system and the cognitive architecture in which the deliberate mind's access to its own best processing is maintained. This internal calm does not require the absence of emotional response. The calmly composed person feels what there is to feel in a difficult situation. What they have is a different relationship with that feeling, one in which the feeling informs the assessment without dominating it, in which the emotional signal is received and used rather than executed as a behavioral output without deliberate participation. This distinction between performed calm as a surface quality and genuine calm as an internal architecture defines the entire project of this audiobook. Performance can be detected by careful observers, and it tends to fail under sufficient pressure when the cost of maintaining the surface becomes higher than the cost of allowing it to crack. Genuine internal calm does not fail this way, because it is not a performance being maintained against internal pressure. It is the actual condition of a trained system functioning as it was trained to function. The training that produces it is what the 10 chapters that follow describe. Chapter 1. Pressure reveals character. When the pressure rises, who you actually are becomes visible. This is among the most consistently reliable observations available about human behavior. Not who you are in ordinary circumstances, not who you appear to be when conditions are comfortable and the social presentation can be maintained with modest effort. Who you are when the conditions strip away the comfort and the preparation and the managed appearance. And what remains is the actual operating architecture of your mind and your character. Pressure is diagnostic in a way that ordinary circumstances are not, because ordinary circumstances do not require the full capacity that pressure demands. In ordinary circumstances, almost everyone functions adequately. There is sufficient slack in the system, sufficient time for considered responses, sufficient absence of genuine threat that the reactive patterns of the untrained mind rarely produce seriously consequential outputs. Pressure removes the slack, it compresses the time, it raises the stakes, and in doing so, it demands the genuine capacity that ordinary circumstances were not requiring. What gets revealed in that demand is real and instructive. The person who appeared calm in ordinary conditions but becomes reactive under genuine pressure was performing calm rather than possessing it. The person who seemed certain in low-stakes situations but becomes indecisive when the stakes matter was performing certainty rather than having genuine confidence in their judgment. The person who was easy to get along with when agreement was the comfortable option but becomes difficult when disagreement carries a genuine cost was performing agreeableness rather than having the integrity that would produce genuine engagement across conditions. This is not a criticism of people who function adequately in ordinary circumstances. It is a description of the gap between performance and genuine capacity that pressure makes visible and an argument for building the genuine capacity rather than cultivating the performance that pressure will eventually expose. Crisis psychology describes what the mind actually does in genuinely high-pressure situations. And the description is important because it explains why the gap between performance and genuine capacity is so consistently revealed by pressure rather than preserved through it. In ordinary circumstances, the deliberate mind is the primary governor of behavior. It has the resources it needs, the time, the working memory capacity, the attentional bandwidth to evaluate incoming information, generate options, assess their likely consequences, and select among them. The process may not be perfect or fully rational, but it is genuinely deliberate in the sense of involving the effortful, reflective processing that considers multiple factors before producing an output. Under genuine pressure, this governance degrades. the specific mechanisms of the degradation, the working memory compression, the attentional narrowing, the temporal horizon compression, the confidence elevation deterioration have been described in detail in earlier audiobooks of this series. The core of what matters here is the effect the deliberate mind becomes less available as the governing architecture, and the fast, automatic, pattern-matching reactive system becomes more dominant. The person under pressure is doing less thinking and more reacting, even when the subjective experience tells them they are thinking clearly. Stress responses are the physiological and psychological mechanisms through which the pressure produces this cognitive degradation, and understanding them specifically changes the quality of what can be done about them. The stress response is not a dysfunction. It is the activation of a system that was shaped for a specific purpose, the preparation of the organism for rapid, forceful response to a physical threat. The physiological changes that constitute the stress response: elevated heart rate, elevated cortisol, heightened sensory alertness, muscular preparation for action or perfectly calibrated for that purpose. They are poorly calibrated for the demands of modern high-pressure situations, which require deliberate cognitive processing rather than rapid physical response. The cognitive consequences of these physiological changes include exactly the degradations that make reactive behavior more likely and deliberate response harder. The elevated cortisol impairs the prefrontal processing that supports complex reasoning and impulse control. The heightened sensory alertness narrows attention toward the perceived threat and away from the broader context. The muscular preparation for action creates an internal pressure toward behavioral output, toward doing something that works against the patience and restraint that considered response often requires. The calm person under pressure is not exempt from these physiological responses. They are activated by the same mechanisms. What is different is the trained regulatory system that mediates between the physiological activation and the behavioral and cognitive outputs it produces. The trained regulation keeps the deliberate mind more accessible, maintains more attentional breadth, tolerates the internal pressure for action long enough for genuine assessment to occur. Not perfectly, the physiological activation affects everyone, significantly enough that the cognitive quality of the calm person's responses under pressure is genuinely different from the cognitive quality available to the fully activated, unregulated person. Character under pressure is the culminating concept of this chapter and the one that explains why the word character rather than simply behavior is appropriate. Character is the stable, consistent pattern of how a person functions across varied conditions, not the pattern of optimal functioning when conditions are favorable, but the pattern of how the person actually is when the full range of conditions is considered, including the conditions that most challenge the functioning. A person's character includes how they behave when the easy option and the right option diverge, when the comfortable choice and the honest choice conflict, when the pressure is high enough that maintaining integrity costs something real. Pressure reveals character because it is the conditions under which character is most determinative. In comfortable circumstances, performance and character produce similar behavioral outputs. Under pressure, they diverge. The performer's surface erodes. The character holds or does not, based on what was actually built rather than what was presented. The character this audiobook builds is not the performance of strength for external observers. It is the actual internal architecture that functions under pressure because it was built to function under pressure, not because conditions are favorable, but because the capacity was developed specifically for the conditions when it is most needed. Chapter 2 begins building the most fundamental layer of that architecture. Chapter 2: Emotional Stability. Calm is an advantage most people underestimate until they see it working. They underestimate it because they have not been taught to value it precisely. They have been shaped by environments that reward the performance of intensity, the visible engagement, the emotional investment that signals caring and commitment, the urgency that communicates seriousness of purpose. In those environments, calm can appear to be its opposite: indifference, disengagement, insufficient appreciation of what is at stake. The cultural association runs that direction. The psychological reality runs the opposite direction. Emotional stability, the genuine capacity to maintain a regulated internal state across the range of conditions that typically produce agitation in most people, is not indifference to what is happening. It is the presence of the regulatory capacity that allows full engagement with what is happening without being destabilized by it. The person who is emotionally stable in a difficult situation is not caring less. They are caring with better cognitive access to the resources that the situation requires. This advantage is not subtle once it is understood. The unstable person under pressure is managing two things simultaneously: the actual situation and their own internal state in response to it. Their cognitive resources are split between these two demands. The stable person is managing primarily the situation. Their internal state is not requiring management because the regulation is happening below the level of effortful intervention. The entire cognitive capacity is available for the situation. Emotional regulation is the specific capacity that produces this stability, and it is worth distinguishing carefully from the related but different activities of emotional suppression and emotional expression. Emotional suppression is the effortful inhibition of emotional experience, the active holding down of feelings that are trying to arise. This approach has a specific cost structure. It consumes significant cognitive and regulatory resource continuously. It tends to produce a particular type of instability in which the suppressed content eventually forces expression in less controlled circumstances, and it prevents the information that the emotional signal carries from being accessible to the deliberate assessment that could use it. Unregulated emotional expression is the opposite problem: the behavioral output of the activated emotional state without the governing influence of the deliberate regulatory system. This is the immediate expression of whatever the emotional system is generating: the sharp reply, the frustrated gesture, the visible agitation that signals to everyone in the environment exactly where the regulatory capacity is breaking down. The information that the emotion carries is being expressed, but without the filtering that makes it informative rather than destabilizing. Emotional regulation occupies the space between these: the full experience of the emotional signal felt, acknowledged, received as information, with the deliberate governing system maintaining enough influence over the behavioral output that what is expressed is chosen rather than automatic. The emotion is present, its information is available. What happens next is still governed by genuine choice. Stress management in the context of emotional stability is not the reduction of stress through the change of external circumstances. It is the development of the internal capacity to maintain the regulated state under external circumstances that are producing stress. This is a significant reframe, and it is worth holding clearly, because the alternative stress management as the arrangement of circumstances to produce less stress is a strategy with an important limitation. It works only as long as you can control the circumstances. Pressure situations are, by definition, circumstances you did not choose and often cannot change. The person who has developed stress tolerance only through the management of external circumstances has no strategy for the circumstances that cannot be managed. The person who has developed genuine internal regulation has a strategy that works regardless of what the external circumstances do. Internal stress management is built through the physiological regulation practices described in earlier audiobooks in this series, the deliberate physical slowing that interrupts the urgency amplification loop, the breathing practices that engage the parasympathetic regulation and reduce the intensity of the sympathetic activation, the attention practices that maintain attentional breadth against the narrowing pressure of the threat response state. These are not exotic or elaborate. They are specific, learnable, and producible in the actual conditions that generate the stress rather than only in the comfortable circumstances of preparation. Calm thinking is the cognitive output of the emotional stability that these practices produce, not the forced calm of deliberate suppression. The genuine ease of a regulatory system that is functioning well, that has received the stress signal, activated the appropriate resources, and maintained the processing quality that the situation requires. The calm thinker in a stressful situation is not thinking about being calm. They are thinking about the situation. The regulation is in the background, doing its work without requiring conscious attention. This background functioning is the goal, the developmental point at which the regulation practices have been sufficiently practiced that they operate automatically, as a feature of how the person functions rather than as an effortful intervention they must remember to apply. The path to that background functioning is the foreground practice that the early stages of building emotional stability require. Deliberate, effortful, consciously applied in the situations that test it. Each time the regulation is applied in a situation that would otherwise have produced the reactive output, the practice deepens, the neural infrastructure strengthens, and the background functioning comes a little closer. Emotional stability is the foundation layer of everything that follows in this audiobook. The calm communication, the clear perception, the patient strategy, the composed leadership, all of these require the regulated internal state as their prerequisite. Without it, they are techniques applied from inside an unstable foundation that will fail. The techniques when the pressure becomes real. With it, they are the natural expressions of a system that is functioning as its best functioning requires. Chapter 3. Thinking in Crisis. While others are panicking, the calm person has already begun to think. This is the specific cognitive advantage of composure that makes everything else in this audiobook possible: the maintenance of deliberate processing access in the conditions that most degrade it. Not partial access, the compromised, distorted, activation-dominated processing of the person who is trying to think through their panic. Genuine access to the quality of reasoning that the situation deserves. The gap between panicking and thinking is not a character evaluation. It is a description of two different cognitive states that the same person can be in at different times, and that different people are in at the same time in the same pressure situation. The panicking state is the activated, reactive, fast mode dominant state described in Chapter 1. The thinking state is the regulated, deliberate, slow mode accessible state that the emotional stability of Chapter 2 produces. These are not fixed traits, they are conditions. Conditions that can be built and maintained through practice. Cognitive clarity in a crisis is the specific quality that the thinking state produces and the panicking state prevents. Clarity, in this context, means the accurate perception of what the situation actually contains, not the fear-amplified version, not the urgency-compressed version, not the caution-narrowed version that the activated state generates as its model of reality. The situation as it is, its actual features, its actual options, its actual constraints and possibilities. Cognitive clarity is not the same as certainty. The calm thinker in a genuine crisis does not have certainty. They have incomplete information like everyone else, and they know it. What they have that the panicking person does not have is accurate uncertainty, a clear model of what is known and what is not known, what can be acted on and what cannot yet be acted on, where the information gaps are and what would fill them. This accurate uncertainty is far more useful than the false certainty of the activated state, which generates confidence disproportionate to the quality of the information it is working from. The specific cognitive practices that maintain clarity in a crisis are worth detailing, because they are the operational expression of everything Chapter 2 built. The first practice is the brief descriptive pause, the deliberate interval in which the situation is described rather than immediately evaluated. What has actually happened, not what it means. Not what it requires, not how serious it is, what has happened, specifically and observationally, as a set of facts rather than as a set of significance evaluations. This separates the signal from the captivation state noise that the fast mode immediately applies to incoming events, creating a cleaner information base for the assessment that follows. The second practice is the explicit inventory of what is not known. Crises typically present with incomplete information, and the activated state fills the gaps with the most threatening available interpretation, a cognitive bias that produces overestimation of the threat and underestimation of the resources available for response. The explicit inventory of unknowns prevents this gap filling from operating unchecked. It creates the specific question, what am I currently assuming that I don't actually know? And the answer to that question almost always reveals that the current threat assessment is partly constructed from assumptions rather than from established facts. Decision-making under stress has a specific failure mode that understanding significantly reduces the combination of narrowed option perception and elevated false confidence. The person under stress perceives fewer available options than the neutral state person would identify in the same situation, and they feel more confident about the options they do perceive than the quality of their assessment warrants. This combination produces the fast, decisive, raw move, the response that felt obviously right in the moment and turned out to be significantly suboptimal when its full consequences became apparent. The calm thinker's decision process under pressure is different in two specific ways. It actively searches for options that the initial assessment is not presenting. Not because the first option that appeared is necessarily wrong, sometimes it is the right one, but because the systematic underestimation of option range in the activated state means that the first option to appear deserves explicit supplementation rather than immediate execution. The question, what other options exist that I have not yet considered, costs 30 seconds and has the potential to produce significantly better decisions. The calm thinker's process also explicitly adjusts for the known overconfidence of the activated state, not by becoming paralyzed by uncertainty, but by holding the initial confident assessment lightly enough to ask what would need to be true for it to be wrong. This is not the undermining of genuine judgment, it is the appropriate epistemic humility that good judgment always requires, applied specifically to the conditions under which calibration is most likely to fail. Strategic thinking in crisis is the application of the 3 moves ahead orientation described in earlier series books to the specific compressed, high-stakes conditions of genuine crisis. The reactive person manages the crisis as it currently presents itself. The strategic thinker is simultaneously managing the immediate situation and modeling the states it is likely to produce, asking what the current choices will create as conditions for the next set of choices, and selecting among available options on the basis of this extended assessment rather than on the basis of immediate relief. The distinction between immediate relief and extended assessment is one of the most consequential in crisis decision-making. Many crisis decisions that appear obviously right from the perspective of immediate relief turn out to be poor from the perspective of the situation they create. The action that stops the bleeding in the immediate moment may do so in a way that forecloses the better options that patients would have preserved. The response that relieves the internal pressure to do something may commit resources or positions that would have been more valuable kept in reserve. Strategic thinking in crisis is the discipline of tolerating the immediate pressure for action long enough for the extended assessment to occur, long enough to ask not just what this option does right now, but what it creates as conditions for what comes next. This tolerance requires exactly the emotional stability that Chapter 2 built and the genuine cognitive clarity that this chapter describes. The person who thinks in crisis while others are still panicking is not smarter. They are more regulated, and the regulation is built. Chapter 4. Calm communication. The voice often reveals who controls the situation before a single word's content is heard. This is a statement about the paralinguistic dimensions of communication, the features of how speech is produced that carry meaning independently of what is said. Pace, volume, prosody, the presence or absence of the characteristic markers of stress activation, these communicate the internal state of the speaker with a reliability that the content of the speech often does not match. The person who is internally agitated speaks with the vocal signature of agitation regardless of what their words are claiming about their state. The person who is genuinely calm speaks with the vocal signature of calm not because they have practiced the delivery of a calm-sounding voice, but because the voice is the expression of the actual internal state. This is the distinction between performed and genuine calm applied to the specific domain of communication. Performed vocal calm is detectable precisely because it is performed. Because the management of vocal presentation under emotional activation requires effort that produces specific tells, the slightly forced quality, the controlled pace that is too controlled, the absence of the natural micro-variations that genuine ease produces. Genuine vocal calm is the natural expression of the regulated internal state and requires no management beyond the maintenance of the state itself. Tone influence is the mechanism through which the calm communicator affects the emotional state and the behavior of the people they are communicating with, and it is among the most powerful and least deliberately used tools in ordinary social interaction. The nervous system of each person in an interaction is continuously receiving and processing the social signals of the other people in that interaction. The vocal tone, the pace, the physical signals, the quality of presence, all of these are read by the nervous system as information about the state of the environment and the people in it. When those signals communicate agitation, urgency, threat, the receiving nervous system partially activates in response, because the information that it is receiving is consistent with a condition that warrants activation. When they communicate calm, regulation, stability, the receiving nervous system tends toward regulation in response. This is not a mystical process. It is the contagion mechanism of the social nervous system working in both directions. Panic spreads through groups, and calm also spreads through groups. The person whose vocal and physical communication consistently signals calm is not just maintaining their own regulated state, they are applying a continuous, gentle, below the level of awareness regulatory influence on everyone in proximity. In a high-pressure interaction, this influence is not gentle. It is significant. The calm voice in a panicking room is providing a competing attrator for the attentional and regulatory systems of every person in that room. Not guaranteed to produce calm, the pressure may be producing independent grounds for activation in each person, and the calm signal may not be strong enough to override them all, but significantly affecting the aggregate activation level in ways that improve the quality of everyone's processing, including the quality of the calm communicator's own reception by the group. Authority through calm speech is the specific social credibility that the calm communicator builds in high-pressure interactions, and it operates through a mechanism that is worth understanding because it is counterintuitive to many people. The intuition that authority requires forcefulness, that the person who commands attention and respect in a high-pressure situation must be loud, urgent, unambiguous, is deeply embedded in many organizational and social cultures. It has some validity. Forceful, urgent communication can produce rapid compliance in genuinely emergent physical situations where the speed of behavioral response is the primary requirement. But it has significant limitations in the more common situations where the quality of the behavioral response matters more than its speed, where what is needed is not rapid compliance but genuine, considered engagement from the people involved. The calm communicator in a high-pressure situation is, paradoxically, more authoritative than the forceful one in most of these situations. The paradox resolves when you understand what authority is actually based on: the credible possession of the qualities that the situation requires. In a high-pressure situation, the quality the situation most requires is clear thinking. The calm communicator is demonstrating clear thinking through their calm, through the regulated pace that signals the deliberate rather than the reactive, through the measured word choice that signals assessment rather than activation, through the quality of presence that signals that the situation is being navigated rather than reacted to. The forceful communicator is demonstrating activation, which is what the situation has already produced abundantly in everyone else. The person providing what is abundant is not providing what is scarce. The person providing what is scarce, the calm, the clarity, the regulated presence in a room of activation, is providing something genuinely valuable and rare. Social signals are the broader category that includes the vocal tone markers and extends to the full nonverbal communication that the calm person produces in high-pressure environments. The physical signals of genuine calm: the unhurried pace of movement, The steady quality of presence, the eye contact that is engaged rather than urgent, the absence of the anxious micro-movements that activation produces are read by the social processing systems of the people in the environment with remarkable sensitivity and reliability. These systems have been continuously calibrated by millions of years of social evolution to read the internal state of other people from their physical expression, and they do so below the level of conscious awareness. The person who walks into a pressure situation with the physical expression of genuine calm is communicating their internal state to every person present before they have said a word. The communication is I am navigating this situation rather than being overwhelmed by it. The effect on others is the same contagion influence described for vocal tone. Their own activation is modulated downward slightly. Their perception of the situation is slightly less threatening. Their own access to deliberate processing is slightly better. These are not dramatic effects in any single instance. Across the duration of a high-pressure interaction, they compound into a significant difference in the quality of the collective engagement with the situation. Calm communication is therefore not just an expression of the internal state. It is an active intervention in the social environment, a contribution to the collective cognitive quality of the interaction that the calm communicator is in. This is one of the specific ways that calm people when under pressure, not just through the quality of their own thinking, but through the positive influence that their regulated presence has on the quality of the thinking of everyone around them. Chapter 5. Reading the situation. When the emotions quiet, the clarity arrives. This statement captures one of the most practically important relationships in the psychology of pressure, the inverse relationship between emotional activation and perceptual accuracy. As activation rises, perception narrows and distorts. As activation reduces through the regulation practices, through the deliberate physiological slowing, through the practices that the preceding chapters have built, the perceptual field broadens. The distortions reduce, and the situation becomes more visible as it actually is. The person who can quiet the emotional activation quickly, who has built the regulation capacity that brings the physiology back toward the regulated state within seconds or minutes rather than hours, has faster access to accurate perception than the person who remains activated. This faster access compounds throughout the interaction while the still activated person is managing decisions from inside a distorted model of the situation. The regulated person is making decisions from an increasingly accurate one. Situational awareness is the developed capacity for accurate, real-time reading of the full situation, not just the immediate focal point, but the complete context in which it is occurring. It is the specific perceptual advantage of the calm observer described throughout this series, applied to the specific demands of pressure situations. Pressure situations typically have a primary focal point, the immediate crisis, the most urgent demand, the most visible problem that has organized everyone's attention. The intentional narrowing of the stress response ensures that most people's awareness is concentrated on this focal point, to the near exclusion of everything that is simultaneously occurring in the wider context. The wider context is frequently where the most important information lies. The secondary effects of the primary crisis that are developing in parallel. The structural features of the situation that explain why the crisis occurred and that, if addressed, would prevent its recurrence. the resources and options that exist in the peripheral field of the situation, and that the full point fixated attention is not seeing. The behavioral signals from the people in the situation that reveal the real dynamics, the actual decision hierarchies, the genuine alignments and misalignments, the emotional states that are shaping the behavior more than the stated positions are. Reading all of this requires maintaining attentional breadth under conditions that are systematically working to compress it. This is not a passive capacity, it requires the active, deliberate redirection of attention to the periphery of the situation, the explicit asking of the question, what is happening outside the focal point? And this deliberate redirection requires the regulated internal state that makes deliberate cognitive direction possible. Observational thinking is the specific mode of cognitive engagement that situational awareness requires, a mode that is different from, and often in tension with, the evaluative and responsive thinking that pressure most urgently demands. The pressure of a crisis creates a strong pull toward the evaluative mode, assessing the situation, generating responses, making decisions, producing behavioral outputs. This pull is appropriate. The situation does require evaluation and response. The problem is when the evaluative mode begins before the observational mode has produced an adequate picture of what is actually there to be evaluated. Observational thinking is the prior mode, the sustained engagement with what the situation contains, without yet evaluating it or generating responses to it. It is the practice of looking before assessing, of gathering the picture as accurately as possible before drawing conclusions from it. This sounds obvious and is very difficult in practice, because the pull toward evaluation is so immediate and so strong that most people are evaluating before they have finished observing. The specific discipline of observational thinking is the practice of maintaining the descriptive stance, attending to what is happening as a set of observations rather than a set of significance evaluations for long enough that the picture is substantially more complete before the evaluative stance is fully engaged. Not indefinitely, assessment and response are genuinely required. Long enough that the assessment is working from a more complete and more accurate observational base than the immediate reactive assessment was using. Interpreting behavior is the most sophisticated element of situational awareness, the reading of the behavioral signals that people produce in pressure situations as indicators of their genuine internal states, actual priorities, and real alignments, rather than as face value communications of their stated positions. Pressure situations produce behavioral signals that ordinary circumstances do not, because pressure removes the management capacity that maintains the gap between genuine internal state and presented external behavior. The person under genuine pressure is less able to manage their behavioral expression than the same person in comfortable circumstances. Their genuine state leaks through in the vocal tone, the body language, the choices they make about where to direct their attention and energy, the degree of initiative they take versus the degree to which they defer. Reading these signals requires the perceptual practices described in the Observer Mindset audiobook of this series, the baseline identification framework for body language, the multi-channel integration of vocal and physical signals, the attention to what people are not doing and not saying alongside what they are. In pressure situations, the signal is particularly rich because the management of the signal is particularly poor. The person who can read the situation accurately, who can see both the immediate focal point and the wider context, who can maintain observational thinking alongside the evaluative demands, who can interpret the behavioral signals that the pressure is stripping away others' ability to conceal, is operating with a model of the situation that is significantly more complete than the model anyone else in the room has access to. This informational advantage is one of the primary mechanisms through which calm people when under pressure. Chapter 6. The Power of Patience. Patience is not the absence of action. It is the discipline of the right action at the right time. The common misunderstanding of patience equates it with passivity, with the waiting that reflects inability to act, or the tolerance that reflects insufficient engagement with the urgency of what is happening. This misunderstanding misses the specific quality that genuine patience requires and represents: not the absence of agency, but the disciplined exercise of it, directed at the temporal dimension of the situation rather than at its immediate content. Patience as a form of strength is the recognition that the question of when to act is as significant as the question of what to do, and that in many pressure situations, the when is the primary determinant of whether the what produces the intended effect. The right action at the wrong time is frequently less effective than a slightly less ideal action at the right time. And the right time is almost always later than the pressure of the activated state is communicating. Strategic waiting is the application of patience in situations where the development of the situation itself will produce better conditions for response than the current conditions provide. This requires the specific judgment that distinguishes between situations where immediate action is genuinely required and situations where the urgency of the activated state is misrepresenting the available timeline, where the actual time available for considered response is greater than the internal pressure is communicating. This distinction is the most demanding cognitive task of the patience practice, because it requires accurate assessment of the situation's genuine timeline against the background of the activated state's systematic overstatement of urgency. The activated state always communicates maximum urgency, regardless of the actual timeline. The strategic mind has to assess the actual timeline through the urgency signal rather than simply accepting the urgency signal as an accurate report of the timeline. The specific assessment asks what, concretely, happens if I wait another hour, another day? What options are foreclosed by waiting that are currently available? What information becomes available by waiting that is not currently available? What conditions develop through waiting that will make response more effective than it would be right now? This assessment frequently reveals that waiting preserves more than it costs, that the options that appear to be foreclosed by delay are not actually foreclosed, that the information that would improve the decision becomes available within the timeline that patience creates, and that the conditions that waiting allows to develop will make the eventual action more effective than the premature action the urgency was driving toward. Timing decisions, the deliberate choice of when to act, speak, or respond, is a skill that the patience practice builds, and it is among the most consistently undervalued skills in the repertoire of effective action. Every action has an optimal timing. The feedback delivered too early, before the recipient is in a state to receive it, produces defensiveness rather than useful engagement. The same feedback delivered at the right moment, when the relationship has the necessary warmth, when the recipient state is sufficiently open, when the context makes the feedback clearly constructive rather than evaluative, produces genuine reflection and change. The content has not changed. The timing has changed the entire outcome. In negotiation, timing determines whether a concession reads as strategic generosity or as weakness. The same concession offered from a position of evident patience and strength reads differently than the same concession offered under the pressure of an impending deadline. The content of the concession has not changed. The timing and the implicit communication about the underlying state it carries has changed what the concession means. In conflict, timing determines whether intervention de-escalates or amplifies. The calm voice that enters a heated exchange at the peak of its activation is unlikely to produce immediate de-escalation. The activation level is too high for the calm signal to compete effectively with the reinforcing signals of mutual agitation. The same calm voice with the same content, delivered after a brief natural pause in the exchange, a pause the calm person can create through the very act of not responding immediately, has a significantly greater chance of producing the shift it is intended to produce. Emotional restraint is the internal capacity that makes the patient's practice possible, the ability to hold the urgency and the impulse toward immediate action without executing them long enough for the timing assessment to occur. This restraint is not the suppression of the urge. It is the receipt of the urge alongside the recognition that the urge is produced by the activation state rather than by the actual timeline, and the maintenance of that recognition against the continuous internal pressure to discharge the activation through action. The urge continues to press. The recognition continues to hold, and in the holding, the assessment can occur. The person who has built genuine emotional restraint is not struggling against their impulses in a way that is visibly effortful. The struggle was in the earlier stages of building the capacity. The built capacity holds without visible effort. The restraint is automatic. The timing assessment is a natural part of the response process rather than a deliberate intervention into it. And the patience is expressed through the quality of presence that comes from genuine certainty about the decision to wait rather than from the effortful management of the urge to act. Patience, when it is built from genuine emotional restraint and grounded in accurate timing assessment, looks like something specific from the outside: absolute steadiness. The person who is waiting with this quality communicates something important through the waiting itself. They communicate that they are not waiting because they have no options. They are waiting because they have assessed the options and determined that the time for the best one is not yet. That communication of capacity held in deliberate reserve is itself a form of pressure on the people waiting for the response. Chapter 7. Strategic Responses. The best decisions are almost never the fastest ones. This is the chapter in which the patience of Chapter 6 and the clear thinking of Chapter 3 come together in the specific practice of constructing responses, the behavioral outputs, the communications, the decisions that pressure situations demand. The practice of strategic response is the practical application of everything the preceding chapters have built, directed at the specific challenge of what to do next. The contrast between thinking before reacting and reacting before thinking is the foundational distinction of this chapter, and it is more consequential than it appears in this simple form. The appearance suggests that the difference is primarily one of timing, that thinking before reacting is simply a slower version of what both processes produce. The reality is that thinking before reacting and reacting before thinking often produce entirely different behavioral outputs. because the processes that generate them are drawing on different cognitive resources and operating from different information bases. The reactive response is generated by the fast mode, the pattern matching, activation-driven, automatically produced behavioral output of the emotional system. Its content is determined before deliberate judgment has been applied to it. It is calibrated to the emotional state that generated it rather than to the actual requirements of the situation. And it is delivered with the specific distortions of activation built in the amplified threat. The compressed time horizon, the narrowed option range, the false confidence. The strategic response is generated by the deliberate mode, the considered, assessment-driven, genuinely chosen behavioral output of the thinking system. Its content is determined after deliberate judgment has been applied. It is calibrated to the actual situation rather than to the emotional state. And it is free of the activation distortions, or at least significantly less burdened by them, because the thinking interval allowed the activation to reduce from its peak before the response was generated. These two outputs on any given individual decision may or may not differ significantly. On a single low-stakes decision, the reactive and the strategic responses may produce similar outcomes. Across many decisions, across the high-stakes situations where calibration matters most, and across the pattern of what they build into the person who habitually uses each, the difference is substantial. Thinking before reacting is not a simple instruction that can be followed by remembering it. It is a practice that requires the prior building of the emotional stability that creates the thinking interval, the pattern interruption capacity that prevents the automatic reactive output from executing before the deliberate assessment has occurred, and the genuine access to deliberate thinking that the regulated internal state maintains. Measured actions are the behavioral expression of strategic responses, the quality of response that is calibrated to what the situation actually requires rather than to what the emotional state is generating as its output. The word measured refers to calibration. The response is sized to the situation. Not larger than the situation warrants the coversion that escalates what could have been contained, that expends resources disproportionate to the demand, that signals more activation than the situation merits and thereby invites matching activation from others. Not smaller than the situation requires the undercretion that leaves genuine issues unaddressed, that signals insufficient engagement with what is actually at stake, that produces the perception of weakness or indifference. The calibration of a measured response requires accurate situational reading, the perception of what the situation actually contains and actually requires, which the calm thinking of Chapter 3 and the situational awareness of Chapter 5 provide. And it requires the emotional neutrality that allows the calibration to be based on the situation rather than on the state, not what this situation is making me feel like doing, but what this situation actually warrants. Controlled responses are the specific form of measured action that high-pressure interpersonal situations require the quality of communication that is simultaneously direct enough to be heard and regulated enough to be productive. Direct communication under pressure frequently fails not because it lacks truth, but because it lacks the regulated delivery that makes the truth receivable. The person who is delivering a necessary and accurate message from inside an activated emotional state is delivering that message with the vocal and physical signals of activation, signals that the receiver's nervous system reads as threat before the content of the message has been processed. the threat signal activates the receiver's defensive response, which reduces their openness to the message's content. The true message, delivered from an activated state, is less effective than the same true message delivered from a regulated one. Controlled delivery is the practice of ensuring that the regulatory quality of the communication supports rather than undermines the content's reception. Not by weakening the content. Direct, clear, unambiguous communication is generally more effective than hedged or softened versions of the same message. By ensuring that the nonverbal signals accompanying the content or communicating the regulated, non-threatening state that maximizes the receiver's ability to hear the content. This practice requires the dual awareness that the observer mindset develops attention to the content of what you are communicating simultaneously with attention to how the communication is landing. Not the anxious monitoring of approval whether the receiver likes what they are hearing. The practical monitoring of receptivity whether the receiver is in a state in which they can genuinely engage with what is being communicated. When the strategic response is built from accurate situational reading, delivered with calibrated measures, and communicated with controlled delivery, the response is not just internally well constructed. It produces the best available outcome from the interaction it is embedded in. Strategic responses win not because they are more forceful, because they are more accurate, more calibrated, and more effectively received. Chapter 8. Leadership through calm. People follow the person who is navigating the situation, not the one being overwhelmed by it. Leadership in pressure situations is not primarily determined by formal authority, by seniority, or by the explicit designation of who is supposed to be in charge. It is determined by the functional reality of who the people in the situation are actually orienting toward, whose assessment they are using to calibrate their own, whose behavioral signals they are taking as cues for what is appropriate, whose presence is providing the psychological anchor that the uncertainty and pressure of the situation is creating demand for. In the overwhelming majority of genuine pressure situations, the person who becomes the actual functional leader regardless of formal authority is the person who is calmest. Not the person who is performing calm, but the person who is genuinely navigating the situation from a regulated internal state while everyone else is managing various degrees of activation. This is not a consensus decision or a deliberate appointment. It is the automatic social orientation toward the person who is providing what the situation most urgently creates: scarcity of the cognitive composure and clear thinking that pressure systematically depletes. Psychological leadership is this functional influence, the leadership that is exercised through the qualities that pressure situations create demand for, rather than through formal authority or explicit assertion of leadership. Psychological leadership does not require the announcement that you are taking charge. It operates through the demonstration of the specific capacities that the situation needs. The calm assessment offered when the group is struggling to see the situation clearly. The considered question asked when the group is generating reactive responses to incomplete information. The steady presence that provides the attentional anchor when the activation level in the room is making it difficult for people to think. The decision made from genuine assessment when everyone else is deferring the decision because the assessment is too difficult from inside an activated state. Each of these demonstrations is, effectively, the provision of something valuable and scarce in the context. and the consistent provision of what is valuable and scarce is how genuine social authority is earned, not through assertion, but through demonstrated supply of what the situation is demanding. Stability signals are the specific behavioral communications through which psychological leadership is exercised, the visible expressions of the internal regulatory state that the people around the leader read as evidence of the capacity to navigate the situation. The stability signals that most reliably produce the leadership-orienting effect are not dramatic. They are the ordinary behavioral expressions of the genuine calm internal state, the unhurried pace of movement in a situation that is urgently demanding hurry. The steady voice in a situation where voices are elevated, the considered pause before response when the room expects and rewards immediate reaction. Each of these is small. Each is noticed below the level of deliberate awareness by the people in the environment. The accumulation of many small stability signals over the course of a pressure interaction produces the consistent impression of the person who is in command of their own functioning. Influence through composure is the long-term, cumulative expression of the psychological leadership that stability signals produce in individual interactions. It is the authority that builds over time. Through consistent demonstration of the under pressure capacity across multiple situations, into the specific form of trust and followership that is more durable than any other kind. This durability comes from the nature of what the influence is based on. Status-based authority is dependent on the maintenance of the status. It erodes when the status erodes. Charisma-based authority is dependent on the presence of the charismatic person. It does not survive their absence. Expertise-based authority is dependent on the domain. It does not transfer beyond the area of established expertise. The authority that comes from consistent composure under pressure is based on demonstrated functional capacity that is domain general, context-independent, and verified through the specific mechanism pressure that is most difficult to perform through and therefore most trustworthy as evidence of genuine capacity. People who have observed someone remain genuinely calm in situations where calm was genuinely difficult have a specific quality of confidence in that person that no amount of impressive performance in comfortable situations produces. The comfortable situation performer can only demonstrate capacity in comfortable conditions. The pressure-verified calm person has demonstrated capacity in the conditions that most test it. This verification is the foundation of the most durable and most transferable form of social influence available. The specific practice of leadership through calm is not the cultivation of the appearance of calm for leadership purposes. It is the building of genuine composure as described throughout this audiobook, combined with the deliberate presence in the situations that demand it. Not performance, genuine capacity deployed in the situations where the need is greatest. The leadership follows naturally from the capacity, not as a goal pursued, but as the recognition that comes to the person who is actually providing what the situation requires, in the moments when it most matters. Build the capacity, the leadership comes with it. Chapter 9. Turning pressure into opportunity. Every crisis situation contains an advantage that is only visible to the person who is calm enough to see it. The reason this advantage is only visible to the calm person is structural, not luck-based. The advantage is visible in the same attentional space that calm perception creates in the peripheral field of the situation that the activated attention of panicking people cannot access. The calm person sees it not because they were in the right place or have special insight, but because they are in the right cognitive state to see what the situation contains beyond its immediate focal point. The mechanism was described in Chapter 5. Attentional narrowing under stress focuses everyone's awareness on the immediate crisis, while simultaneously reducing awareness of everything occurring in the wider context. What occurs in the wider context, while attention is concentrated on the focal crisis, includes things that are not parts of the crisis, including things that may be directly useful, are directly relevant to positioning for what comes after the crisis resolves. Opportunity inside chaos takes several specific forms that are worth identifying because recognizing them in real time is a clearable perceptual skill, not a mysterious capacity for identifying silver linings. The first form is the vacuum of competent function. In a genuine crisis, the cognitive and attentional resources of most people in the affected environment are consumed by managing their own activation and the immediate demands of the crisis itself. The work that was being done before the crisis, the maintenance of the infrastructure, the forward-looking planning, the relationship management, the quality of execution monitoring either stops or degrades significantly. The person who maintains enough composure to continue functioning competently in these areas while the crisis is consuming everyone else's attention is providing rare and valued service in conditions where its value is amplified by its scarcity. The second form is the informational richness that crisis produces. As described in Chapter 5, pressure strips away the behavioral management that people maintain in ordinary conditions and reveals the actual characteristics of their thinking, their decision-making, their priorities, and their relationships. A crisis is an observation opportunity, a window into how people and systems actually function under real demand, as opposed to how they function under the managed conditions of ordinary operation. The calm observer who is gathering this information while simultaneously navigating the crisis is building a more accurate model of their environment than any amount of ordinary observation would have produced. The third form is the changed landscape that every significant disruption creates. Crises disrupt existing arrangements. They break down structures that were stable. They open questions that were settled. They create uncertainty in domains that were previously certain. This disruption is experienced by most people primarily as loss, as the damage to the prior state that the crisis has produced. But disruption also creates openings, positions that were previously occupied that are now available, arrangements that were previously fixed that are now negotiable, directions that were previously closed that are now accessible. Strategic advantage in a pressure situation is the deliberate use of the informational and positional opportunities that the crisis creates, by the person who has the composure to see them and the patience to act on them at the right time rather than before the right conditions have developed. The word deliberate is important. The calm person who perceives the opportunity has the advantage of perception. They do not automatically have the advantage of the opportunity unless they also have the strategic thinking to assess it accurately and the patience to time its use correctly. The opportunity seemed too early, acted on before conditions have sufficiently developed, can produce worse outcomes than not acting at all. The same opportunity seen at the right time, understood accurately, and acted on with the precision that considered timing allows, can be transformative. This is the full expression of the calm advantage in pressure situations, not just the maintenance of clear thinking while others cannot think clearly, but the specific use of that clear thinking to identify, assess, and act on the advantages that the crisis creates and that the reactive people around you are too activated to see. Calm perception is the specific quality that makes all of this possible: the sustained, accurate, broad-field perceptual engagement with the full situation that the regulated internal state maintains. Not just seeing what the crisis presents in its immediate form, but seeing the full situational context in which the crisis is occurring, including the features of that context that are not the crisis itself and may be more significant than the crisis in the longer trajectory of what the situation is part of. The person with calm perception is continuously gathering from the full situation while engaging with the immediate demands. They are building a complete picture, while most of the people around them are managing partial pictures distorted by activation. And the complete picture contains the opportunity that the partial pictures do not include. This is ultimately one of the most concrete and specific expressions of why calm people when under pressure. Not just that they think more clearly, that they see more, and seeing more. They understand more, and understanding more, they are positioned to act more precisely, more effectively, and with better timing than anyone who was managing less of the picture. The crisis is not the obstacle for the calm person. It is the context in which the advantage is built. Chapter 10. Quiet confidence. True confidence is rarely the loudest thing in the room. This chapter closes the audiobook's architecture by naming the quality that all preceding chapters are building toward and by distinguishing it precisely from the versions of confidence that are more common, more visible, and less real. Loud confidence, the kind that asserts itself, that fills space with certainty, that produces the impression of authority through the volume and forcefulness of its expression, is often the confidence of the person who is not fully secure in what they have. Genuine security does not typically need external validation through the performance of its own quality. The most forceful displays of confidence frequently accompany the most significant underlying uncertainty, the uncertainty that the forcefulness is managing by preempting the external challenge that might reveal it. Quiet confidence is the quality of the person who has built something genuine and knows what they have built. The security does not come from external validation, from the agreement of others, or from the performance of certainty for an audience. It comes from the direct experiential knowledge of having functioned well under conditions that test functioning, of having maintained composure when composure was difficult, thought clearly when clear thinking was scarce, and produced responses of genuine quality when the conditions were least favorable for it. This distinction between performed and genuine confidence is not merely philosophical. It has specific practical consequences that are visible in the differences between how each type of person navigates the situations that test them most. The person with performed confidence navigates challenges primarily through the maintenance of the performance, through ensuring that their certainty remains visible, that their authority is not challenged, that they are not placed in situations where the gap between the performance and the genuine capacity might become apparent. This navigation requires significant energy directed at the management of appearances, and it is specifically vulnerable to the kind of pressure that this audiobook has been building around: genuine, unanticipated, high-stakes pressure that does not cooperate with the management of appearances. The person with genuine quiet confidence navigates challenges primarily through engaging with the challenge itself, through applying the actual capacities that have been built to the actual requirements of the actual situation, without the overhead of managing a performance alongside the substantive engagement. Their energy is available for the situation. Their attention is directed at the situation. And the composure they display through this engagement is not a performance maintained against internal pressure. It is the natural expression of a system that knows what it is and trusts what it has built. Inner stability is the internal foundation of quiet confidence, the settled, consistent sense of what you are and what you have that provides the anchor from which engagement with any external situation proceeds. Inner stability is not the absence of uncertainty about outcomes. Outcomes are genuinely uncertain, and the inner stability of quiet confidence does not require pretending otherwise. It is the certainty about process, about the quality and reliability of the cognitive and emotional resources you bring to the engagement with uncertain outcomes. Not knowing that things will go well. Knowing that you will engage with what happens from the best available version of your own functioning, whatever the outcome requires. This pro-certainty is built from the accumulated evidence that the practices of this audiobook produce. Every pressure situation navigated with genuine composure is evidence that the composure is real. Every clear-thinking episode in conditions that were working against clarity is evidence that the clarity is a built capacity rather than a circumstantially dependent appearance. Every patient strategic response that produced better outcomes than the reactive response would have produced is evidence that the restraint and the strategic thinking are genuine tools rather than aspirational ideals. The accumulation of this evidence across many situations, many tests, many applications of the practices that the preceding 9 chapters have built, is what produces genuine quiet confidence, not a decision to be confident. The natural consequence of having built something real and having the experiential record that verifies it as real. Calm authority is the social expression of this inner stability, the quality of presence that the genuinely confident person brings to social environments, which communicates the settled strength of the genuine article rather than the managed performance of the performed version. Calm authority does not assert itself through forcefulness. It establishes itself through consistency, through the accumulated demonstration, in varied conditions across varied interactions, of the same quality of composure and thinking and judgment. This consistency is the social evidence from which the authority is built, not a single impressive performance in favorable conditions, but the reliable functioning across the range of conditions that includes the unfavorable ones. In pressure situations specifically, calm authority has the specific form described throughout this audiobook, the regulated presence that provides psychological stability to the people in the environment, the clear thinking that provides better assessment when assessment is most needed, the patient strategic responses that produce better outcomes than reactive urgency would generate, and the leadership through composure that people orient toward because it is providing what the situation has created demand for and scarcity of. Psychological presence is the cumulative quality that all of this produces, the specific way of occupying space in an environment that communicates, without words, the internal state and the genuine capacity of the person who has built what this audiobook describes. Presence is not performance. It cannot be manufactured in the same way that verbal confidence can be manufactured or that composed body language can be practiced in isolation. It is the total expression of the internal state, the sum of all the signals that every aspect of a person's engagement with the environment produces simultaneously, and the quality that those signals collectively communicate to the people receiving them. The person who has built genuine composure under pressure has genuine presence in pressure situations, not as a quality they are trying to project, but as the natural expression of what they have become through the training that the preceding chapters describe. The presence communicates, I have been here before, not necessarily in this specific situation, in situations that required what this situation requires, and I was adequate to them. That communication is quiet. It is not announced. It does not require validation from others to be real. It is simply present in the quality of the engagement, in the pace and calibration of the communication, in the steadiness of the presence in the midst of pressure. This is what calm people have that reactive people do not. And this is why they win. Closing. Built for pressure. 10 chapters, 10 layers of one architecture. The architecture is built for a specific purpose to function at its best in exactly the conditions that are most hostile to functioning well. Not the comfortable conditions. Any system functions adequately in those. The pressure conditions, the genuine, unanticipated, high-stakes situations where the gap between the trained mind and the untrained one is most consequential and most visible. Chapter 1 established the diagnostic principle that makes the entire project urgent. Pressure reveals character. Not the character you present in comfortable conditions, but the actual operating architecture of your mind and your capacity. The reactive patterns that ordinary conditions never required you to interrupt. The regulatory capacity that ordinary conditions never required you to exercise. The genuine composure that ordinary conditions never required you to have, as distinct from the performed composure that ordinary conditions made sufficient. Understanding what pressure reveals is the beginning of understanding why it is worth building the capacity to meet it with something real. Chapter 2 built the foundational layer: emotional stability, the actual regulated internal state that genuine calm requires, and that makes everything else possible. The distinction between performed calm as a surface quality and genuine calm as an internal architecture. Emotional regulation as the governance of behavioral response to feeling, not the suppression of feeling itself. Stress management as internal capacity rather than external arrangement. And the crucial consequence, calm thinking as the natural cognitive output of the regulated state, available without effort to the system that is functioning as its training designed it to function. Chapter 3 made the cognitive advantage concrete, the specific quality of thinking available to the person who maintains composure when others cannot. Cognitive clarity as accurate perception of the actual situation rather than the activation distorted version. Decision-making that explicitly compensates for the known biases of the activated state. Strategic thinking as the extended assessment that considers what each available option creates as conditions for what follows. The calm person begins thinking while others are still panicking, and the quality of their thinking across the entire duration of the pressure situation reflects this head start. Chapter 4 applied the calm advantage to the domain of communication, the primary medium through which the internal state becomes visible and influential in social environments. Tone influence as the mechanism through which the calm communicator affects the emotional state of everyone in the interaction. Authority through calm speech is the specific social credibility that measured, regulated communication produces in contrast to the abundant activation signals everyone else is generating. The stability signals that communicate genuine navigation of the situation before a word has been evaluated for its content. Chapter 5 built the perceptual advantage that emotional stability enables the situational awareness that sees the full context of a pressure situation while others see only the focal point. Observational thinking as the prior mode that must produce an adequate picture before the evaluative mode can produce an accurate assessment. The behavioral interpretation skills that read the pressure-stripped signals of genuine internal states that ordinary conditions conceal. The informational richness of the calm observer who is gathering from the full situation while the activated people around them are managing partial and distorted pictures. Chapter 6 named patience as a form of strength, the specific, disciplined exercise of agency directed at the temporal dimension of the situation rather than at its immediate content. Strategic waiting as the judgment that the development of the situation will produce better conditions for response than the current moment provides. Timing as the skill that makes the right action at the right moment possible. And emotional restraint as the internal capacity that makes patience possible, the receipt of the urgency impulse alongside the recognition that the impulse is produced by activation rather than by the actual timeline. Chapter 7 built the practical behavioral architecture of strategic response, the specific quality of action that the patience, clarity and calibration of the preceding chapters produce. The contrast between the reactive output of the fast mode and the considered output of the deliberate mode. Measured actions as the calibrated behavioral expression of accurate situational reading. Controlled responses as the communication quality that ensures the content is receivable rather than defended against. Chapter 8 established the social consequence of consistent composure leadership not through formal designation, but through the functional orientation of people toward the person who is providing what the pressure situation has made most scarce. Psychological leadership as the provision of clear thinking, steady presence, and genuine assessment when those qualities are most needed and least available. The stability signals that accumulate into the psychological leadership authority, and the durability of the influence that pressure-verified composure builds compared to any other basis for social authority. Chapter 9 revealed the specific advantage structure that calm perception creates in pressure situations, the opportunity that crisis contains, and that only the regulated mind can see. The three forms of opportunity in chaos, the vacuum of competent function, the informational richness of pressure-stripped behavior, and the changed landscape that every significant disruption creates. And the full expression of the calm advantage, not just maintaining clear thinking, but using that clear thinking to see, assess, and act on what the crisis makes available to the person who has the composure to look for it. And Chapter 10 named the destination quiet confidence, the genuine, experience-verified, internally anchored quality of certainty that is the natural expression of having built something real and having the evidence that it holds under genuine test. Inner stability as pro-certainty rather than counter-certainty. Calm authority as the consistency of demonstrated functioning across the full range of conditions, including the unfavorable ones. Psychological presence as the total expression of the internal state that no performance produces and no pressure can strip away. What this audiobook has built is a specific relationship to pressure. not the relationship of someone who avoids it or manages it through the cultivation of favorable circumstances, or performs their way through it until the performance fails. The relationship of someone who has built the internal architecture that functions under pressure as its best functioning requires. This architecture does not make difficult situations easy. It makes you adequate to difficult situations genuinely, demonstrably, across the full range of the pressure that a serious and engaged life produces. The pressure rises. You think, others react. You see the full situation, others see the focal point. You wait for the right moment, others discharge the urgency. You respond from genuine assessment, others respond from activated pattern. You provide stability, others are looking for it. This is what was built, layer by layer, practice by practice, pressure by pressure. Calm wins.